Hey, it's Friday, and it's time for the next in our Fanzine Friday series. This is News from Bree number 21, published in April of 1977. And if you stick around to the end as a special bonus today, I'm going to do a live reading of the poem by Lee Gold that appears in this issue of the Fanzine. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, we take one of my fanzines down off the shelf for a closer look, and today that's News from Bree number 21 by Hartley Patterson, published in April of 1977. It's a really good fanzine. It's going to be a great way to celebrate the end of the year. Please stick around. So we're back with the next in the Fanzine Friday series, and this is going to be a really good one to end the year. News from Bree number 21, published in April of 1977 by Hartley Patterson. Jam-packed with all kinds of stuff. I think this video might be a little longer than normal, but there's so much good stuff in here I want to share with you, so I don't want to miss any of the best parts. Here's the cover. Really funky art by Stephen Lyons, who's done the last couple of covers. This one looks like some type of an alien sci-fi type world to me. It's got some mushroomy type plant that's growing and some alien bug creature that's flying around right there. But some really good art. His editorial's kind of short and turns into sort of a news of what's going on. So let's talk about that in a little more detail. As an aside, I just want to mention, never seen this, I don't know any way to ever find it, but he mentions that he has available, if you send him a self-addressed envelope, a guide to D&D publications, which remember they've done all the supplements now from the old box, OD&D kind of series, right? The wood grain box, wood or white box. He has a manual to understand D&D that he's put together, and some stuff about diplomacy and other fantasy and sci-fi games. Okay, so let's get into the editorial and in particular the news he has to talk about. He mentions he's changed the size right down to the same size as like Underworld Oracle. It's starting to really look like and feel like the classic really good UK fanzines from this era. Interesting news about what's going on. So Gamesday he has just been to, which was put together by Games Workshop. It's their, I want to say it's their equivalent in the UK of Gen Con. And there's a new book called Dice Men, which is a history of the early days of Games Workshop by Ian Livingston and Stephen Jackson, I believe. And I'm about a quarter of the way through. It's really good. I've just gotten through reading about this stuff. So they had their second Games Day in February of 77. These guys were able to attend. Talked about all the excitement that was going on there. Talked about Empire of the Petal Throne, Red Moon and White Bear, among other science fiction games, and some miniatures, which he'd not had a chance to see people buying and trading those before. Dungeons and Dragons Day just happened on March 12th. And Games Workshop did that as well. They did sort of the main convention for broadly for games, and then one specifically for Dungeons and Dragons, both of which, from reading the other book, were quite packed with a lot of explosion of interest in Dungeons and Dragons. He also mentions that Hartley has gotten himself to be the chairperson of the new Dungeons and Dragons Society there. So I wasn't familiar with Hartley, but apparently he's kind of a central figure in the early days of Dungeons and Dragons organization stuff there in the UK. And then he talks about some new stuff that's coming on the market. The first one he talks about is Palace of the Vampire Queen, which we all recognize as being the first published module put out by TSR, sold by TSR, created by a group called We Warriors, and they called it the Dungeon Masters Kit #1, and they had a couple others we might talk about in some other videos. So he gives his impressions of that, which he says, is a nice product with a bunch of maps, several levels, lots of rooms, and of course the monsters that are in there. The only same thing I noticed when I looked at my own version of that, an awful lot of the rooms are just empty, which I think they said was basically, they guessed was based on the random dice rolls that are in, for example, the books about how to stack those. He says generally he thought it was okay, even though it obviously ends with a lot of undead, including a vampire, which I don't think is very good for beginning characters. He mentions another fanzine. This is an APA called Troll Crusher. And the APA, like Alarms and Excursions and the Wild Hunt, which are ones I'll talk about at some point, are a different concept where each person sort of does what they call their own fanzine, which is, 1, 2, 5, 6 pages. You type it up and print all the copies and mail all your copies of your pages. Then somebody puts those all together, staples them or binds them somehow, and that's what gets circulated, to everyone who submits, as well as anyone else who's on the sort of subscription list. And it's a really different concept from the things I've been looking at, and really interesting. So Troll Crusher at the beginning, that's what it was. And so he talks about that. He says the first one was put out in March of 1977. And tells you how to get in touch, and you can be maybe part of that. Talks a little bit more about Tunnels and Trolls, which has just been released in the UK as with slightly updated version. Metamorphosis Alpha, which has just come out from TSR. He's very complimentary of James Ward's rules, how clearly they're written and laid out, and how much more sense, frankly, they make than Dungeons and Dragons. Something called Warriors of the Green Planet, which is actually a trilogy of games. You've got Warriors of the Green Planet, which talks about land-based battles, Mind War, which introduces mental dueling, and War of the Sky Galleons, which is then the giant spaceships that fight overhead. And also, the second edition of White Bear and Red Moon had come out, which he's, again, very complimentary of. Says it was a great game to start with a few quibbles. Then he says they've addressed all those for the second edition, making it a really great game. It's sort of a board game with some battles and stuff like that. And then Outreach, which is Spies Conquer of the Galaxy effort, which is okay. All right, so let's go to the table of contents. That was a lot right there in the news page, right? So by page 2, we've got the news and reviews I just covered. Then John Norris is going to do reviews of miniatures. These are from the Conquest series. And then there's some reviews in here of role-playing games, Bunnies and Burrows, which is, I've never played. I kind of like the concept, and from Watership Down. They talk about it and say, look, we thought this was a joke, but it's actually a pretty good game. And then a guy named Boris, I don't know who Boris is, he doesn't have a last name, talks about Lankhmar, which is Fritz Lieber's setting, and this is a board game that was put out. And then we get into the Dungeons and Dragons content. We've got an adventure in here now, The Tomb of Jain Dzebek. I'll talk about that in more detail. You Bash the Balrog, which is by the famous Lee Gold. That's who puts together Alarms and Excursions. She's a sort of legend in Dungeons and Dragons, been there from the very beginning. So I'm going to do that at the end, her poem, which is pretty funny. And then Hartley's Fanarzal's Guide to Dungeons, which is just his commentary for dungeon, some ideas for dungeon masters. The letter section, which is always really good stuff. And like this time, he's got a letter from Don Turnbull, from Lou Pulsipher, and a guy named Peter Woodland. But some really famous folks writing in. Lou talked about a little bit about Hartley's comments on the supplement that was put out by TSR, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. Talks a little bit about what he does. He says he has his initial campaign he uses with people is going through Moria from Lord of the Rings. He gives you one of the characters from the books. He says, so you're already sort of familiar with who people are. He thought that was an easy way to get into the game. He gives stats for the character, how he stats up the characters from Lord of the Rings. And everyone, always struggles to figure out what to do with Gandalf, right? As does he, because he's sort of a blend between Dungeons and Dragons version of a cleric and a magic user, right? They call him a wizard, but he doesn't seem to have a lot of wizard spells. So, and then talks about a couple of other things, and then Don Turnbull's talking about some ideas and things, experiences he's had running his game. For some reason, he said he doesn't like torches, so he puts light bulbs in all his dungeons so that they're lit up. I guess he didn't want to deal with the fact that people constantly couldn't see, or torches were constantly getting blown out or whatever. I get the point, but it's sort of what it is. You want to go dungeon delving, it's going to be dark down there. And then he mentions also someone put out a new character class called the Seductress, which we covered in the last episode of the last issue, I believe. Somebody has a slightly different take on it, but very similar concept. The next thing is The Great Bike Robbery, which is just some fiction as far as I can tell. It just looks like a story, tells you who all the people are, and you just sort of read a little bit of a story. These Dungeons and Dragons adventurers. And then there's a poll at the back where he lists 34 things, and he's asking people, like, what do you want to see in the fanzine? Everything from fanzine discussion, monsters, articles, spells, character classes, science fiction, fantasy, Tolkien, other authors, all the way down, how big it should be, on and on and on and on. So I'll be interested to see in future issues of this magazine how the folks responded. Although he has been a little crabby in some of his writing, saying he always asks for input and he barely gets anybody to write in. So we'll see. Maybe as circulation has improved, he'll be getting more content going forward. Okay, so between the size of table contents and the number of contributors, and I think I've left a couple of people who sent in new monsters off of here. But anyway, it's quite the list. Hartley puts the fanzine together. Stephen Lyons did the cover. Nick Slope, Paul Thompson, Adrian Cuthbert, Sue March all do art. We'll take a look at that. Boris does the review for the new Lankhmar board game. John Norris does reviews of miniatures and the review of Burrows and Bunnies. Chris Cooper, I think, had a new monster, and Lee Gold has the poem or song, which I'll be doing at the end of the video. Okay, so the fantasy figures, I just wanted to take a look at this, if you can see how much detail is on there. This is for the new Conquest Age of Joman range, he says. And so, for, especially back in the day when we didn't have the internet, we didn't have catalogs, this would have been really valuable to have all this really detailed explanation he gives for each and every one of the monsters in the range. I mean, just like the last issue, you read these descriptions and you want to go buy them all. I don't know anything about these miniatures, but now I'm really interested to go and see some of them. All right, here's our art. So this is Sue March, and she did 2 drawings. She's got this naked lady here who's hanging out with a lion for some reason, and this funky psychedelic looking lady in the robes with the belt and the spear. I don't know what it is, but again, it's funky. I kind of like it. And then this is Paul Thompson. I don't know what he's drawn here. It looks sort of cartoonish, with a bunch of whiskers and a big something coming out of his head with horns on it. Here's this guy, Nick Slope, and so I'm going to do a little technology here and make myself disappear so you can see all of his art. He did a lot of drawings of soldiers. He's labeled a few of them. They didn't go with anything in particular. I think he just liked to draw them, and he sent them in, and the folks here at News from Bree decided to use them. The next page we have is the rear cover, and this is Adrian Cuthbert's contribution. I really like it. One of the things I really like about all this old Dungeons & Dragons stuff is how good the art is. It just got a different feel to it. Like, I wasn't that talented, but it's the kind of stuff I would have drawn if I had better ability to draw, as opposed to the fantastic professional-looking art that's in everything. You sort of see that's D&D related today. All right, here's our new monsters. Killer Ted, as in teddy bear. The 2-foot-high asbestos teddy bear comes towards you. Oh, look how cute, until steel claws come out and he slices you and bites you. And because he likes to bite things with his steel teeth, he's got all kinds of nasty stuff growing in there, and his bite can give you a disease. That's by Rory McLean. I didn't mention him before. Here's Chris Cooper, the assassin bug. Large insect bite also can cause disease that'll be fatal in a couple of weeks. So I thought it was going to be like just a giant bug, right? No, this bug also, the reason he's an assassin bug, is carrying a laser blaster, which I probably wouldn't allow in my game, but he says it, does 2d8 damage at a range of 100, so I probably wouldn't allow that. The last one I don't really understand, to be honest with you. The contributor's name is Bill Howard. It's called Fogs and Things. The idea there is kind of funky. You roll d4, crimson, gold, silver, or rainbow color. You roll d4 again, whether it's fog, cloud, mist, or haze. And he says, here's just some random examples of what happens to your parties. Some of these I like, some of them not so much. The party won't be able to talk for 2d6 turns. I like that. The party shrinks to 1/3 their normal size, which means everything else in the dungeon starts looking bigger for 2d10 turns. My favorite one, it turns everything it's a steel, I would do iron, to gold. So at first you're like real excited, but then like that gold armor and that gold shield or sword, like they break as soon as something hits them, right? So that's not so good after all. Then here's one I don't understand. The party goes up 1 in 3 gradient. I think they're probably walking up the mist or the fog. And then when it clears, they fall. Another one is all sound is amplified, and so it doubles the chance of wandering monsters. So that's pretty good. All right. This is one of my favorite phrases. Old school goodness. This is the Tomb of Jain Dzebek. This is Hartley's dungeon. It's really fantastic. It's sort of a classic thing that you would get. There's an evil wizard, super powerful. He's died, he's buried, he's forgotten. There's been a heavy rain that's caused a sort of slip or slide on the side of a hill, and these old doors are revealed. And rumors, spread that this is his burial tomb, which of course it is. The wrinkle, so potential players, plug your ears, don't listen to the spoiler. The wrinkle is he didn't really die. He'd come up with a spell to make him look as if he were dead, to put him into sort of a comatose state. Apparently he didn't test it out. It doesn't work the way it was supposed to. He was essentially comatose for several hundred years, and somehow in the middle of that he gets transformed into a lich. And so he's down in the bottom. One issue sort of with dungeon ecology, so they say, well, while he's been unconscious, other creatures have moved in. It's a pretty good dungeon. I like the layout, the traps, secret doors, but so they've also got these open shafts, right, that go up and down. I kind of like the way these old school dungeons sometimes get designed like that. The only thing I don't get, like I said, from a dungeon ecology point of view, is how these things are getting in and out. So I'd probably tweak that a little bit so that there was a sort of back way in to make that make some sense. But otherwise, this is just excellent. It's probably a long session. If you were old school days where you played 4, 5, 6 hours at a time, probably you could play your way through this as long as the combat doesn't bog down. It's not filled with monsters. It's got lots of rooms with other stuff going on as well. So all in all, I think it's a pretty A+ thing. Here's Fanarzel's Guide to Dungeons, and this is Hartley's tips for dungeon masters or young players. So he sort of says, look, the last 2 issues I gave you a bunch of background. Now I'm going to give you like tips for your first game. The first one is for the dungeon master. He's got 3 rules. 1, don't cheat, which is a good rule, but I sincerely stop and think about it. He's like, don't fudge the dice rolls. If there's no wandering monsters for the whole night, just let it be, right? Make your saving throw, fail your saving throw, etc. Just let the dice play out. That's his suggestion. Number 2, he says, is the flip of that, which is you always have to be prepared. Be prepared to improvise. Players will do things you don't expect. You need to make things up and be able to sort of roll with the flow. And number 3, which is very important, have consistent rules. He says it doesn't matter which rules from TSR you use or don't use, what house rules you use, but the important thing is that you're very clear about what the rules in your game are going to be. And I would say in this day and age with more mature players who know how to play, that they understand what your house rules are as well. Those are great rules even today, right? Number 2, conduct for the players. Number 1 rule, the DM is not necessarily always right, but the DM's ruling is final. And he said, so don't tell me what happened in other people's dungeons. You need to know when you're at the table, be respectful. The DM has done a lot of work to prepare, to bring the players together, to run this whole thing. You got to be respectful that they get to make the rulings. And he said, if you have issues, well, you can leave, and you can talk to them about it afterwards, but not during the game. Number 2 rule, he says, remember, which goes to the first one, dungeon masters have their own rules, so just because this was the rule at somebody else's game doesn't mean it's going to be the rule when you come to a new dungeon master. And third, which is a great rule, when you come to play. He says, don't even let a great issue of News from Bree distract you. He says, play, participate, be an active part of the game. That's why you're there, which is a great rule. And the last thing he talks about is, he calls it rules of admittance, which is something that's been debated around in the recent issues of this fanzine, which are, can this character only go into a particular dungeon master's dungeon, Or can they play one week with this dungeon master, the next week the same character goes into a different dungeon master's dungeon, then he comes back to this dungeon master? Sort of like, do you recognize the experience points or the magic items that they gain? Or, is your world linked? It's the kind of thing I think mature dungeon masters know how to work through. And he has a tip, right? If somebody shows up with too much of something, somebody comes looking for them, whether they've got too much of a reputation so people are after them, or they've got too many nice magic items so someone wants to come and steal them. It's like, you can figure out ways to deal with that. But he says, the dungeon masters in your gaming group need to figure out what that rule is going to be. All right. If you stuck around to the end, as promised, this is called You Bash the Balrog. It says, song by Lee Gold to the tune of Waltzing Matilda. Illustrations here are by Nick Slope again. And so I'm not going to sing, but I am going to read you You Bash the Balrog by Lee Gold. Here we go. You Bash the Balrog by Lee Gold. Once a jolly cleric and a magic-using elf, and a mighty dwarf with a sword +3, left their native village out to get their share of pelf. You bash the Balrog while I climb the tree. First they met a goblin with a fire-breathing hound. They webbed and they bashed and they scragged him with glee. Afterwards they searched them and a magic potion found. You bash the Balrog while I climb the tree. The low wisdom swordsman picked it up and drank it down, changed to a wolf immediately. No one could dispel it, so they headed back to town. You bash the Balrog while I climb the tree. Then a loud voice bellowed, Who has slain the Goblin King? Round turned the heroes. What did they see? Swooping down upon them was a Balrog on the wing. You bash the Balrog while I climb the tree. Help! Screamed the cleric. Ditto! Yelled the elven mage. The wolf whimpered low and he tried to flee. The Balrog fell upon them and his flames began to rage. You bash the Balrog while I climb the tree. They ran through the forest looking for a place to hide, pursued by the Balrog so fierce to see. Wait, said the elf mage, I have got a plan, he lied. You bash the Balrog while I climb the tree. Once a mighty Balrog slew a cleric and an elf, and a smallish wolf who had teeth +3. Skinned them and tanned their hides and kept them on a shelf. You bash the Balrog while I climb the tree. So that's it for News from Bree from Hartley Patterson in 1977. And that is it for Fanzine Friday for 2022. I hope everybody's had a fantastic year. I hope you're having a great holiday and all the best for the new year. If you like the series, please, you can give us a like. Please subscribe. If you know other people who'd like to enjoy this old school goodness that we have here on the channel, please ask them to subscribe as well. Have a great weekend. Roll some dice with your friends. And until next time, keep rolling 20s.